Hello, I'm Brett Baer, and welcome to Episode 2 of the Unauthorized History of Socialism. The second half of the 19th century was marked by growing industrialization in Europe and America. In Russia, peasants were moving to the cities, and a system based on serfdom and huge land holdings was breaking down. Karl Marx had predicted that these trends would inevitably lead to revolution as the masses rose up against those who owned what he called the means of production. But it just wasn't happening. As we'll see, socialists in North America, Europe, and Russia had very different reactions to this apparent failure in Marxist theory. We start in Germany, under the rule of the Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. The rapid rise of socialist ideas in Germany frightened the country's rulers. In 1878, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck outlawed all socialist activities, driving many members of the Social Democratic Party into exile. Among them was a young bank clerk named Edward Bernstein. He soon became editor of the party's clandestine newspaper, first in Switzerland and then in London.
When Bernstein goes to England, he becomes acquainted with Marx and Engels, and Marx and Engels become very enamored of him. And after Marx dies, Engels asks Bernstein if he will put together from Marx's notes a fourth volume of Capital. And when Engels dies, he also is asked to be one of the executors of Engels' will. So he was very closely tied to Marx and Engels and seen in the period after their death as one of the most important international socialists.
But Bernstein lived in a very different era from that of his mentors. Standards of living were changing in ways quite different than Karl Marx had predicted. It wasn't long before Bernstein began to question his Marxist faith.
I think that he thought that capitalism was evolving along the lines of becoming more and more inclusive of the working class. And he had some empirical evidence that showed that the working class was not getting poorer, and it showed that, therefore, the Marxist vision, somehow, something was wrong with it.
Bernstein decided he had to face his doubts. He wrote, "This cannot go on. It is idle to try to reconcile the irreconcilable. What is necessary is to become clear just where Marx is right and where he is wrong." Bernstein's critique became known as revisionism, and it stirred up an urgent debate among socialists around the world.
Bernstein said that what usually is understood to be the final goal of socialism is nothing to me. The movement is everything. That really caused consternation in the party, because people thought that Bernstein had given up the great goal, and the great goal of socialism, as we know, of course, was the breakdown of capitalism, and Bernstein was no longer interested in, or did no longer believe in, the breakdown of capitalism. And if that's the case, then Bernstein actually was no longer a Marxist socialist, and if that's the case, it's as though the Pope in Rome was no longer a Catholic.
Thousands of miles away, a 29-year-old Siberian exile was carefully following the debate. His eventual response to Bernstein's criticisms would forever change the face of socialism. His name was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known by his nom de guerre, Lenin.
Lenin was, first of all, probably Russia's most exuberant workaholic in a country that did not have a work ethic. He was enormously hardworking. He was enormously smart. He had supreme self-confidence and a belief that he really knew what was right for everybody, and particularly for the future of his country.
When Vladimir was 17, his older brother Sasha was executed for plotting to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. It was the beginning of his own path to revolutionary action.
After he got to the university, and he took part in a demonstration, which was not political. It was directed against some regulations of the university. When he was arrested, and it was discovered that he was the younger brother of the executed terrorist, he was expelled from the university. And he was a top student. So he had to spend several years in idleness.
Vladimir was banished to his family's country estate. There, he began to explore the stacks of radical literature his executed brother had left behind.
He read various Russian revolutionaries, read Karl Marx, and began to come to the conclusion that it was just as important as his brother had thought to create a new social system for Russia, that revolutionaries had to learn to toughen themselves, to make themselves into heroes who were going to give their all to save Russia, something like his brother had done.
Vladimir's radical activity would land him in deeper trouble with the law. By the time he heard about Edward Bernstein's writings nearly a decade later, he was in exile yet again, this time in Siberia. His life now revolved around one goal: revolution.
Lenin was an individual who was often in a state of rage. That was his personality. But he was infuriated by Bernstein. But unlike a lot of the others, Lenin, in effect, realized that Bernstein was right, that the workers were not becoming revolutionary.
When Lenin returned from exile, his younger brother met him at the train station. Dmitry Ulyanov would later recall the first topic on his brother's lips: the need to refute Bernstein. Lenin soon laid out a radically different idea of what to do if the workers wouldn't make the revolution.
He developed quite early on what I would call a politics based on the absence of trust. So if you can't then trust the workers to make a revolution, whom can you trust? And Lenin said the only people you can trust are full-time professional revolutionaries like himself, who will make a revolution in the name of the people.
Lenin, in effect, said, heck with the workers, the revolution is everything. Except Lenin wasn't quite that honest. He didn't say, heck with the workers. He said, we'll have to discover the vanguard of the workers or of the proletariat, and that will be, well, me and my pals, and we'll make the revolution for the workers.
For Lenin, this was more than just a theory. In 1900, he left for Europe to start an underground newspaper, Iskra, or Spark, to ignite a revolutionary movement in Russia. In the summer of 1914, 50 years of peace in Europe came to a bloody end. Soon the entire continent was mired in the fiercest conflict the world had yet seen. The Great War hit Russia particularly hard.
There was a breakdown of transport. There was inflation. And in the northern cities, particularly the capital city of St. Petersburg, or Petrograd as it was then called, there were great shortages of food and fuel. So the winter was very, very harsh.
By early 1917, the ground was crumbling beneath the Tsarist regime. As Russian troops battled Germany, strikes and protests spread across the country. Then in Petrograd, a group of soldiers mutinied. It was the beginning of what became known as the February Revolution. To prevent a similar uprising on the front, the Tsar abdicated the throne. Power fell into the hands of a liberal provisional government.
There was a kind of chaos and anarchy that grew very quickly in Russia after the February Revolution, after the emperor had abdicated. Land was being seized by peasants. Villages were declaring their independence and sewing their own flags. And you have the idea that whatever the bonds, the glue that will hold a society together, fear, loyalty, tradition, it somehow melted away and evaporated with Russia crumbling into the smallest parts.
Many Russian socialists welcomed the new liberal government, but not Lenin. He had lived in exile in Europe for most of the past 15 years, sometimes traveling in disguise. All the while, he had worked to strengthen and arm a new party in Russia, the Bolsheviks, even ordering bank robberies and extortion to finance party activities. Now he saw the chance he had been waiting for. On October 25, 1917, the Bolsheviks struck. This is a later Soviet reenactment of Lenin's men storming the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. In reality, the revolution was much less dramatic. The provisional government yielded with little bloodshed. Many didn't expect the new regime to hold on to power any longer than the provisional government had.
When Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power, they really were a tiny minority. And immediately, the Bolshevik regime found itself embroiled in a civil war, which it won militarily, but it also won because the Bolsheviks had been very successful in their use of propaganda to win what we might nowadays call the hearts and minds of the Russian people.
Through posters, leaflets, and speeches, Lenin tried to convince Russians of just who were the enemies of the people and who were their saviors. But Lenin didn't stop with propaganda. The enemies of the people were marked for retribution, including priests, many peasants, and his political opponents. Lenin began with Nicholas II, the last Tsar to reign over Russia.
Him, his wife, their 5 children, their doctor, their servants were all massacred. And then their bodies were cut up and burned, and then what was remained was buried in a shaft, which was only discovered a few years ago. Then, in August of 1918, a revolutionary who felt that Lenin had betrayed the revolution took 2 shots at him and wounded him almost fatally. Whereupon Lenin and his henchmen agreed to carry out Red Terror. This was a terrible thing. People were taken out of prison where they were put political prisoners who had never been tried, had done nothing against the Bolsheviks, and were just summarily shot. And this shooting went on. Hundreds of people were shot at night.
Many others found themselves banished to forced labor camps. Later, under Joseph Stalin, the system would become known as the Gulag.
A part of the Red Terror was the gathering of all opposition members into concentration camps outside of major cities. And these were the very first camps, and it was from these camps that the entire Gulag system developed. So they are very much a precursor to what came later in Stalin's time.
The Tsar had been reviled as a tyrant for executing a handful of violent radicals. Under Lenin and his followers, millions would die at the hands of the state.
It's difficult to calculate how many people came to die under Lenin's system and then Stalin's system because there were so many different ways to die. There were people who died in camps. There were people who died because they were machine gunned down in the woods. There were people who died because they were deported. There were people who died in artificial famines. When you begin to put the numbers together, you get numbers, statistics in the tens of millions.
Lenin, in general, had no sympathy for human beings such as they were. He believed, as did others, that through education and legislation you can make people not want to own things. You create new human beings. So the existing human race was so rotten that killing them was actually progressive.
Amidst terror and war, Lenin was building a system of government unlike any seen before. Along with the old regime, Russia's capitalist industries, the banks, and the church were all completely destroyed. Replacing them all was a single institution, the party. Most of the Bolsheviks had no experience in business or administration, yet they drew up a plan to manage a country with the world's 5th largest economy and its 3rd largest population. The results were a far cry from heaven on earth.
By 1920, in some ways you can say that civil society and civilization had stopped. There was massive famine. The industry had broken down, the railroads stopped working, the economy had fallen apart, and people were really reverting to the most primitive kind of bartering. Massive loss of life. It was a nightmare.
By now, Russia had conquered most surrounding nations and rechristened itself the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Bolsheviks now called themselves communists. That term had long been interchangeable with socialist, but it took on a very new meaning as Lenin broke all ties with the rest of the world's socialists and formed a new international movement. He had big plans for his revolution.
Lenin said more than once that he never believed that the revolution could be confined to Russia. No, the revolution had to spread. It had to spread to the industrial countries of the West. First of all, Germany, Great Britain, ultimately the United States, and so on.
In the Marxist scheme of things, the most advanced capitalist country was the one that was supposed to be transformed first, and that was the United States of America. But ironically, socialism never gained the popularity in America that it gained in almost all other countries, basically because its main constituency, or supposed constituency, the working class, the labor unions, simply didn't accept it. They wrestled with it for a while and then rejected it.
In America, the split between trade unions and socialists goes all the way back to the very beginnings of the organized labor movement in the late 19th century. Spurred by Marx and Engels, workers' movements across Europe were gaining strength, and most were embracing socialism as their guiding philosophy. In America, too, workers were organizing, but they would choose a very different path, led by a straight-talking cigar maker named Samuel Gompers.
The irony about Sam Gompers is that he was a Marxist who forged an anti-Marxist labor movement. Gompers was born in a poor family in London and moved to the United States in his teens, becomes a skilled cigar maker. And all this time, he is a socialist. He's reading Marx, he's reading Engels, he's reading other classics of European socialism. And he believes that the best way to organize workers to demand their emancipation, the best way to achieve socialism is by making the trade unions themselves stronger.
Gompers rejected the idea that workers needed radical intellectuals to help them achieve their goals. I saw that betterment for working men must come primarily through working men, he wrote. I saw the danger of entangling alliances with intellectuals who did not understand that to experiment with the labor movement was to experiment with human life. Gompers and his allies favored something called pure and simple unionism. It meant using strikes and boycotts to fight for better pay and benefits, rather than taking political action to create a whole new system. In 1886, Gompers helped found the American Federation of Labor, uniting individual unions across the country. As the AFL's first president, his salary would be less than he earned rolling cigars. Gomper's leadership of American workers would be challenged by socialists within and without the AFL. In 1901, some of these socialists came together to form the Socialist Party of America. At the party's helm was a rival labor leader, a railway man named Eugene V. Debs.
Debs is a fascinating figure because he's one of these perennial candidates who runs for president 5 times as a Socialist Party candidate. He achieves at most 6% of the vote, which he gets in 1912. But he's an enormously popular, charismatic figure, much more than Gompers ever was.
Originally, Gompers had hoped he and Debs would work together, but he ended up calling Debs the apostle of failure. He was involved with the Western Labor Union, then the American Labor Union, then the IWW, and Gompers felt any attempt to organize a rival trade union was, in effect, doing the employer's job to weaken the union. You then had union fighting union.
By 1903, the American Federation of Labor represented more than 1.5 million union members and was becoming a force to be reckoned with in American life. At that year's AFL convention, Gompers forever parted ways with his old allies. "I want to tell you, socialists," he said, "that I have studied your philosophy. I have kept close watch upon your doctrines for 30 years, have been closely associated with many of you, and I want to say that I am entirely at variance with your philosophy. Economically, you are unsound. Socially, you are wrong. Industrially, you are an impossibility." Despite Gomper's opposition, the Socialist Party continued to gain strength. Surprisingly, the party drew more support from farmers than from industrial workers. One of the greatest centers of socialist support was Oklahoma. Eugene Debs won more than 16% of the presidential vote there in 1912. But America's entry into World War I brought a turning point for the party.
In World War I, socialists in this country and around the world have to decide, will they support their individual nations in the war, or will they support the International Socialist Brotherhood and oppose the war of workers against other workers? And the American Socialist Party, unlike most of the European socialist parties, decides to oppose the U.S. government and to oppose World War I. And most trade unionists, Gompers as their leader, support the war.
The more moderate socialists leave the party and actually work with Gompers in the AFL. The more radical socialists start speaking out against the war, and they are arrested. Eugene Debs gets arrested in 1918, gets sentenced to 10 years in jail. And by the time he comes out of jail in 1921, when he's pardoned, the Socialist Party is pretty much a shell.
The party would never regain its pre-war strength, not even during the Great Depression. Gompers and the American Federation of Labor, later the AFL-CIO, had won out as the principal voice of America's workers.
In many ways, Americanism proved to be a substitute for socialism for a lot of workers. After all, Americanism has always stood for the average person being able to make it. The American standard of living is something that all Americans should be able to enjoy. So the idea of class equality is something that undergirded the strength of socialism in Europe, but it's always been part of the American vision as well. So in many ways, Americanism trumped socialism and made socialism unnecessary as a vision for a lot of American workers.
But socialism would yet find life in North America. As the Socialist Party faded from the U.S. political scene, some of the farmers who had embraced its ideals would take their politics north to Canada.
today Americans think of Canada as a more radical, a more socialist place. Well, the irony is that Canada's first socialist politicians, Canada's first socialist intellectuals are Americans. And that is something that people today have forgotten. Socialism, when it comes to Canada in an effective way, is an American import.
Between 1898 and 1915, nearly 1 million people emigrated from America to Canada. Lured by cheap farmland, most settled in the western Canadian provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, the last North American frontier. They brought their knowledge of how to wrest a living from the soil and a set of political convictions rooted in their experience.
Farmers in the prairie provinces of Canada and the northern Great Plains of the United States all faced similar problems in the early 20th century. They were all growing wheat. They felt that they were being gouged by the railroads, by the bankers. They felt that the market conditions were working against them. Rather than seeing this in terms of impersonal market forces, they personalized it and viewed bankers, railroad men, lawyers as the enemy.
The way you express your protest at the turn of the century is, hey, wait a minute, why don't we nationalize these things? And from that, as the institutions resist, you move fairly logically and pretty quickly towards radicalism. And they're radicalized in Canada in the same way, by the same people, in the same organizations as they are in the United States. But let me emphasize, these organizations start not in Canada, but in the United States.
Every major U.S. farmers' organization would resurface in Canada in some form. By the 1920s, these organizations and their successors began to make their voices heard throughout the prairie provinces.
They were very soon able to influence electoral politics in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta simply by the power of their numbers. But it's really not until the Great Depression begins on the prairies, really in the 1920s, not the 1930s, with drought, with the collapse of the wheat market, that farmers began to contemplate forming their own independent political force.
In 1932, a new political party emerged from a conference in Saskatchewan, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the CCF.
The CCF is a kind of big bang among radical groups. Radical farmers, socialist labor unions, and radicalized socialist intellectuals, many in universities, many also in the Protestant churches. And they get together and they write a platform that calls for the socialization, essentially, of the means of production and the means of finance. I mean, it is a classic socialist platform.
The party would later moderate its platform to appeal to a broader base. In 1944, the CCF swept the provincial elections in Saskatchewan, becoming the first socialist government in North America and leaving a lasting imprint on Canadian politics.
Well, the CCF stayed in power in Saskatchewan until 1964. And one of its last acts was to bring in a socialized medicine scheme for the province of Saskatchewan, which they imposed in the early 1960s and which had such tremendous appeal that it actually pushed Canadian politics in that direction later in the 1960s. The CCF's ideas were adopted by the governing Liberal Party of Canada, and the Liberals were the ones who finally brought in national Medicare in Canada.
In 1961, the CCF was renamed the New Democratic Party. It is still largely socialist and still a force in Canadian politics. Now, under the leadership of Jagmeet Singh, a 40-year-old criminal defense lawyer and the son of Indian immigrants, the NDP advocates what it calls a New Deal for the people, which includes subsidized housing and childcare, a further expansion of Canada's socialized medical system, a wealth tax on the country's richest citizens, and a huge government investment in green energy. If it all sounds familiar, well, remember the roots of Canadian socialism were planted first in the United States. Some of the ideas championed by socialists in the early part of the 20th century found their way into the mainstream of American life. Ideas like unemployment insurance, Social Security, and the 8-hour workday. But no socialist party ever gained real traction in U.S. politics. The largest, the Democratic Socialists of America, now counts only 56,000 members. But they boast 2 members elected to the House in 2018, each with growing influence within the Democratic Party: Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York and Rashida Tlaib of Michigan. As they say in the boxing ring, the Democratic Socialists of America punch well above their weight. Be sure to join us for the next episode of The Unauthorized History of Socialism. I'm Brett Baer. Thanks for watching. Next time on The Unauthorized History of Socialism, from China to Britain to Israel to Africa, a new generation of leaders brings to life radically diverse visions as socialism comes to power around the globe with devastating results.